Hi, Ryan. How are you?
Good to see you.
You as well.
Well, we'll get started. Hi, medium, and to everyone watching, and to everyone who's going to be watching later. Joining me on stage is Ximena Vengoechea. Ximena is a former user research leader at companies like Pinterest, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and she's the author of Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Lost Art of True Connection. Her new book, releasing on September 26th, is called Rest Easy, Discover Calm and Abundance Through the Radical Power of Rest, which you can actually pre-order now and save 30% at the link below, or you should see a little modal on the screen there. Now, Ximena, Rest Easy is a guide to breaking the burnout cycle. Before you became an author, you spent a decade or more in user research at some of the world's biggest tech companies, what I imagine are very high pressure environments. How did those experiences inform your writing this book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. Yeah, you sort of alluded to it a little bit in those high pressure environments and how they may have contributed to my writing this book. I would say there are sort of two main things that came out of that experience and how they tie to the book. The first is that these are rapidly growing companies. You're often understaffed. The research function in particular, I think, tends to lag behind growth of other counterparts like engineering and design. And so you often have much more work than you can do, which makes you really good at prioritization, but also can be exhausting. 100% my experiences there definitely contributed to my own sort of like personal moment of burnout, where I was working my 9 to 5. I was leading a team. I was working on my first book. I had just become a mother. It was the pandemic. So all of these things kind of happened at once that led me to this moment of feeling just totally burnt out. So that's the sort of negative. How did it lead to this moment? But I would say that the positive, on the other hand, is that as a researcher, your job is to understand people, what makes them tick, what they're motivated by, what their needs are. And my specialty on the qualitative side is really interviewing people and getting to understand them and kind of going deep on a variety of topics and turning these kind of like messy conversations into insights and stories. And those are skills that I very much use today in my career as a writer and in this book. And so I interviewed many people about their relationship to rest and really got to dig deep into like where do these feelings about rest come from? Why do we feel the way that we do about rest? What are some of the practices that we might engage in? And I think it was, both meaningful for the book. Those stories are in the book, but also personally meaningful for me, especially at the beginning of my journey into burnout and then rest, because it quickly became very clear that this wasn't a me problem. This wasn't just I was doing something wrong. This is something that so many of us grapple with today.
Yeah, I think it's one of the universal experiences for anybody who's working, coming to that point of burnout, of overwork. It's very common, and I think all too common today. Looking back in history, leisure used to be a status symbol. That's something you write about. The more successful you were, the more leisure time you had. Today, the opposite is kind of true. Our culture encourages us to perform success and productivity like 24/7. Even to admit you're tired is actually seen somehow as a sign of weakness, even though, like we just talked about, that's a universal feeling. But somehow the world wants us to deny those very natural feelings. What do you think it is about modern life, and I know this is a big question, that compels us to collectively dispossess these feelings and these very natural parts of life?
I think it's a variety of things. Culturally in the US, we have this very strong cultural narrative that, um, you know, working hard is how you make it, right? And so there's these stories of the sort of like rags to riches narrative, the immigrant dream, anybody can make it here.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Exactly. We can all kind of recite a few of these, right? And I think that, there's the good side and the bad side, right, of that narrative. The good side is like, yeah, we do have stories of people who have made it from nothing, and who have built lives for themselves and have become great successes in their own way, whatever that means to them. And that can be really heartening. I think the downside of that narrative is that if you don't succeed, if you don't, put the work in as much as you feel you should, or if you do and your business endeavor or whatever it is that you're working on fails, it can feel like it's totally your fault. And so there's an unwillingness to kind of like step back for a minute. And those narratives really belie the fact that there's so much else that gets involved that contributes to whether or not like your hard work will become, equal success, right? Like there's like the privilege of race, ethnicity, like gender, class. There's so much that goes into that. But when we really double down on that narrative, it becomes a question of like, are you capable? Are you personally capable? Not anything else. And I think that is part of what drives this sort of constant pressure to do more as a means to proving ourselves within this larger, cultural narrative, which, by the way, is, it's everywhere. If you're not paying attention to it, it's already internalized. But if you look at the media, we have coverage of, what is such and such entrepreneur, what is their daily routine? Oh, they wake up at 5 a.m. They have this green juice. They wear this uniform, like, right? Like, and we eat that stuff up. That's why it keeps getting covered, is because we like to consume that kind of content. So it's super pervasive. And I think that combined with technology and where we are in this moment where you are expected to be always on, right? Like you could be, in theory, reached by your manager or a teammate at any moment. It's sort of on you as the individual to say, I'm going to turn my Slack notifications off tonight. Like I am actually logging off, or I'm not going to check my email, because in theory, you can be reached at any point. I think that too, combined with social media, which is kind of our stage for performing all of this, right? So all of these stories and all of the ways that we could be doing more sort of get trotted out on the stage of social media, where we highlight those successes. There's nothing wrong with highlighting your successes, whatever they are. But it sort of reinforces this narrative that like everyone is doing a lot. And then we can kind of feel like, I am not doing enough. And it's all just like completely skewed, right? It's like you're using these glasses that are like just so productivity filtered. And I think we don't realize that we can actually take those off.
Yeah, the presentation of success is so filtered. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. Increasingly they do, but it's easy to forget it when you see people announcing their successes one after the next. You feel like you should be doing that too. And you mentioned the one of my favorite genres of hate reads, which is, this is what this $10 million CEO does every morning to stay successful. And it's the green juice and the ice plunge and the yoga session followed by the weightlifting session, all before 7 a.m. And often these stories completely ignore the fact that people have families, people have don't have the means to afford a lot of, what are often luxury habits. So it's interesting how much social media has, I think, perpetuated this cycle of performance of success, which forgets that with those successes come failures, come a lot of hard work. And that's stuff you never see. So the book is called Rest Easy. And before we go on, I want to define what rest is to you and in the context of the book. You actually write at one point, if you're wondering whether an activity is restful, it's probably not. And that stuck with me. So I was hoping you could go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, so this was a question that felt very present to me when I kind of hit this moment of burnout and realized that something had to change. And I ended up leaving my job and kind of thought in my head, like, well, if I quit my job, like I will be able to easily recover from this burnout. You know, like essentially in my head, there was this sort of equation that was not working equals resting. Like if I'm not working, I'm resting. And I very quickly realized that that was not true. You can be not working and still feel exhausted and burnt out. And so, I sort of set out on this personal quest to understand, well, what is rest and how do I do it? I think that I had, like many of us, I had a really good idea of what a work ethic was, you know, of like how to do the work. I didn't know how to rest. And I found myself asking these questions like, you know, like, well, is watching TV rest? Like, does that count?
I think everyone probably thinks of that as rest, but you say it isn't.
Yeah.
At least for some people.
Yes. So I what I learned is, you know, no, it doesn't count. And I'll explain why. Essentially, the way that I define rest is any activity that is going to leave you either calm or at ease or energized. Those are kind of the two sides of that coin. It's like you can either relax, bring yourself down, or amp yourself up as a result of rest. Also, crucially, you should feel better than when you started in some way. And so the reason that I don't count things like binge watching Netflix or losing an hour on TikTok or, you know, doom scrolling as rest, which I think a lot of us do feel that way. We get to the end of the day and we are just so exhausted. There is nothing more that we can do except kind of queue up, you know, one of those things, something where it's just super passive and we're just kind of like zombies in front of a screen and like just, you know, that's all we can handle. The reason I don't count those things as rest is because usually we feel worse afterwards. So we're scrolling the news and we see some story that like spikes our anxiety level or that stresses us out in some way. Social media, we know there have been studies that show like it's not great for your mental health. Similarly, you know, watching Netflix for hours, your show of choice, all of those things, especially at night, you're sitting in front of a screen, that's going to make it more difficult to sleep. Multiply that by 10 if you've watched something particularly like upsetting in some way, right? Like something really violent or something that's going to get your heart rate up, like a horror movie, whatever it is, right? So I don't count those things as rest because usually we feel worse afterwards. And I think that, you know, if you get to that point where you are so exhausted that the only thing you can do is sit in front of the screen, what that probably means is that you should sleep. It's probably a sign that, yeah, tonight, like that's the kind of rest that you do. Let's try again tomorrow. Let's see if you feel a little bit better tomorrow. But yeah, that's how I define rest: is calming, energizing. Does it lead you to better?
Do you see a difference between relaxation and rest? You know, it might feel relaxing to veg out on Netflix for 2 hours as you're unwinding at the end of the day, but it might not actually be restful. So, I'm just wondering if those are two different things or you think of them as synonymous.
I think that they're related, but I think again, it's sort of like, is it really relaxing if you're vegging out on the sofa and then like feel not great afterwards? Like, is that the kind of relaxation that, I mean, certainly I think for me, having, done all of this research, that feels like candy. Do you know what I mean? It feels like empty where you go.
Junk food.
It's junk food. Yeah. It's like, yeah, you know, if you're really hungry and you have some junk food instead of a real meal, are you less hungry afterwards? Like, yeah, but do you also like probably have a pretty bad crash later and like feel a little bit queasy or feel a little bit tired, like whatever your version of a junk food high and crash is, like doesn't feel great. And so would I recommend, having a diet of all junk food? No. So that's how I would think about it.
So I also want to define burnout. We've defined rest. I think most people know that burnout is a bad thing, has a negative connotation and association, but in the abstract, at least speaking for myself, I haven't really thought deeply about like, what is burnout? How does it affect us physically, mentally, emotionally? You had your experience with burnout, based on your work schedule and your family schedule. How did it manifest for you? And how does it manifest for others more generally based on your research?
So burnout is usually the result of chronic unmanaged stress. And there are sort of two main spheres where we see it. One is in the workplace and one is in your family life. So like parents can experience burnout just like workers can, which I think I would say, I feel like until fairly recently, like the pandemic, we thought of burnout as specifically like, this is something you get when you work, but it really is something that you can also experience in these caretaking environments as well. And what it is, what it manifested for me, and I think this is quite common, is you're very tired, like you're fatigued. There's some kind of sense of exhaustion. There's a sense of overwhelm. There's like more things that you can do, and that's really overwhelming. And there's also a sense of detachment or disconnection. So if you are feeling burnt out at work, you might start to feel like, why does this matter? Like, what is this project even important? Is my role even important? Am I like, you can really get quite existential with it if you want. Like, am I contributing to the world in some way? Right? It can go in all sorts of directions.
Been there.
Yes, right, exactly. We're like, what am I on this earth to do? And am I doing it? Right. But and then I think also what's quite common is tied to that. There's a sense of losing confidence in your abilities. And I think that's important because what it can start to feel like is, you're tired, you're overwhelmed, you don't know if any of this matters, and you're not sure if you can do anything about it, right? Like if you felt confident before in your abilities, maybe there was something about your work environment that you didn't like and you wanted to change, or maybe there was something that you loved and you really wanted to make better. That sort of like gusto starts to fade away, and you really start to just feel quite drained by all of those things. And in parenting, it can be more of an emotional disconnection where you just, you feel the work part of it, but you don't feel the joy part of it. You feel pretty detached from the emotional connection, which is hard. And all of that, doesn't feel great, but also has some effects on your memories. It's not great for your memory. It's not great for your immune function. And it can even like raise your risk of cardiovascular disease. So it like feels bad and also has some pretty negative effects on our bodies.
Yeah, I like to think of the body as a system. And when it's overloaded with stress, it causes all of these problems that collectively can do harm in one way or the other, which is not a good thing. Right. So glad we're talking about it. I want to talk about some solutions to these feelings of burnout. I think a lot of people, and speaking more specifically to the work context here, who are feeling immediate reaction is to try to buy their way out of the problem. I feel like that is maybe a very American way of thinking. And there's an entire economy built around this, different software courses, et cetera, that are built around enhancing someone's productivity. But you talk about those almost as Band-Aids. They're denying the underlying problem that is putting someone in the position in the first place to feel like they're not doing enough, to feel like they're not productive enough. So how do you think about these quick fixes? And can you talk about productivity dysmorphia, which is related here and was something that stuck out to me in the book?
Yeah. So, when we think about these tools, I mean, first of all, the idea that we can sort of like buy back our time in some way, or become so efficient that we have more time, I think reflects a particular mindset where I, in the book, I call them sort of gold star resters. It's the people, and I count myself in this group, so this is like no shade, but this is like you believe that you need to like check everything off your list before you can rest, right? You get the gold star for completing the project or for completing the task, and then you've earned rest, as opposed to just rest being something that we all deserve, like point blank, like that's it, right? So when we have this mentality, it is very seductive, the idea that there might be a tool that could speed up our work process, because that means we're going to get more time back, and hey, we can rest, like hopefully sooner, or we can play, or we can do whatever we want with that time. The problem is that usually what those tools lead to is more work. So for example, if you get better at email, you get faster, you use all the shortcuts, what do you get? You get more email. Like the sooner you respond to an email, the sooner you're going to get a response. And it's the same for, say, completing a project at work sooner. You finish something before the deadline. You don't get to take off like 2 weeks. I mean, maybe you do, but most people don't, every time they hit like a project milestone, go like, okay, like I'll see you later, right? It's like you talk to your manager and they're like, great, now you can move on to project B. Like there's always more for you to be working on. And so while it's like very appealing on some level, this idea that, we can get more done and have more time for, rest and other things, the reality is that we're really compressing things. We're just speeding things up by using these kind of shortcuts and productivity hacks. And they don't really get us what we want. And when we sort of continuously do this, where we're sort of like racing through our work and trying to be uber efficient, and then moving on to the next, we often miss a moment to pause and appreciate what we've done and recognize that we have achieved something, because we are so busy already focusing on the next thing. And that's where things like productivity dysmorphia can come in. So that's the feeling that you have this sort of objective achievement, but your subjective experience of it is totally disconnected from it. So a concrete example, when I published my first book, like that was a huge achievement. That was something that I had been thinking about for many years, since I was like in second grade. I wanted to be a writer, like just like it was big, right? And when I published that book, I didn't make sufficient space to celebrate. I thought I did, but I didn't. And I know that I didn't, because one of my first reactions was, okay, well, that's done. Like, what's next? And so I was like already on to the next thing. And I don't think that I'm unique. I think that many of us fall into this trap of just going, check what's next on the list, instead of really pausing and appreciating it. And so if we want to sort of like have our objective achievement match our subjective experience, we have to create the space to pause and go, wow, I accomplished this thing. And like, I'm so grateful for, the people in my life who supported me, or I'm really proud of the skills that I developed in order to do this, or whatever it may be that got you to that moment. And just sitting with it instead of immediately moving on to the next thing, which kind of just keeps us on this treadmill of doing.
Yeah, the hedonic treadmill. I'm completely guilty of this. I think it's so common for someone who's high achieving and ambitious to finish a project, achieve a goal, like you did writing your book, and then not really see the forest for the trees. We can only see 1 or 2 standard deviations from where we are today. But that elementary school student who dreamed of publishing a book one day would probably be over the moon to know that that goal was finally accomplished. But then when it actually happens, it's like, okay, on to the next. And there's just this impulse, and I think it's self-generated for so many people, but it's also culturally enforced, to not take the time to reflect and celebrate oneself, which, as you write about, is really important. I want to talk about another issue that I think a lot of high achievers can relate to, which you write about. They tend to feel a sense of guilt, shame, anxiety, or even fear when they slow down. That inner voice is telling them they can and should be doing more. You reference a Buddhist term for this called the monkey mind, one that never stops. What would you say to someone who's struggling with that kind of low-grade hum of anxiety in the background that makes it so difficult to slow down and take a rest?
Well, first I would say this is very common. And in some ways, it's not surprising in that the brain is sort of meant to wander on its own. And so, you're basically what's happening here is like your brain is latching onto this idea of like, I need to be working harder. I need to be doing more. I am not enough without this output, right? And these messages can come at any point. And, the same sort of like the same part of the brain that causes these intrusive thoughts to like come in, even when you're like, shh, like I'm trying to relax, just go away. That's the same part of the brain that also like helps us daydream and helps us come up with creative solutions to problems, and brainstorm. And so I guess the first thing I would say is it's common in part because the brain is sort of working as intended, it's just that it's more problematic when we get stuck in this negative thought pattern where we believe that we have to always be doing more and achieving more. And I think with that, it's really about starting to separate out our sense of self and our self-worth from output. And this is uncomfortable. So I don't say this as if like, this is really easy, like no problem. It's uncomfortable. And it's why so many of us start to get a little bit antsy when we do have a moment to rest. Many of us have what's called idleness aversion. So we really don't like being idle. We find it very uncomfortable. This also has roots back to like the Protestant work ethic, where there was this idea that, idle hands are the devil's workshop. You got to stay busy, where we kind of imbue work with this moral superiority to being still or doing nothing or playing or resting. So I think reminding ourselves, though, that we are not our work. We are not our output. Our, worth as individuals doesn't come from whatever shiny achievement we've achieved. It comes from who we are as people, and trying to remember that and trying to internalize that we are enough. We don't always have to be moving. We can just be. And sometimes that is the gift, that is the reward, is just to be present and here and enjoy this moment with your friends or with your family, or with your hobbies, whatever that looks like for you. And I think if you're, really stuck and you find like you can't sort of transcend into this like present like moment of appreciation, just one very quick sort of meditation or activity that you can do is just to use all of your five senses in the moment. So you're just tracking like, the smell of the coffee beans, the touch of your clothes in the closet, like the sight of, the trees outside your window, whatever it is, just try and use all of your five senses to take you out of this moment of like, what else can I do? Nothing. Like, what else you can do is just like observe, be part of this moment, appreciate it, and try and remove yourself from that sort of like, frankly, like very small world of like more doing, right? It's pretty limiting if you think about it. The idea that we're here just to execute. That's a very small part of our world that we often kind of like blow up. And so bringing yourself into the present moment and using your five senses is a way of just kind of like peeling it back a little bit and going, oh wait, there's more here. What else?
Work is not identity. A lot of people, I think, believe that. Something else I'm guilty of. But we are multifaceted, and life is multifaceted. It's easy to get stuck in that way of thinking, but probably not the healthiest. You see these little nuggets on Twitter or LinkedIn sometime, and who knows if they're actually true. Maybe you do. About researchers who interview people on their deathbed. And one of the most common regrets is working too much. No one on their deathbed ever wishes they worked more. Now, is it true? Maybe, maybe not, but it does ring true.
Yeah, and I think, again, if you go, especially to go back to the idea that so many of us are burnt out and we're already feeling disconnected from our work, it doesn't feel like a stretch, right? That eventually, on your deathbed, so many of us already don't regret like our connection to work. We're already re-examining it. It makes sense to me that later on in life that would feel even more re-examined. But to the extent that we can try to course correct in some way now, I think all the better.
So we touched on the type A personalities, the high achievers who feel that sense of guilt when they're slowing down. There's another group, and it probably overlaps to a certain degree, but it's those people who are just naturally scatterbrained, whose minds wander, they have trouble focusing. There's obviously medical diagnoses for some of these issues. How can rest help people who are experiencing problems like this to slow down, to focus more clearly, to see the world move a little bit more slowly?
Yeah, rest is, for all of us, is going to help us focus better and concentrate better. What often happens is that, we may be scatterbrained by nature, and that's fine. But often we're doing things, our behaviors are such that they're exacerbating or contributing to the sense that we can't focus or concentrate. And so one of the big culprits to be aware of is multitasking. And we do this all the time at work, but also at home. We feel like we can, check our email while we're watching a TV show, or, make a phone call while we're also, attending to some other task, or even just switching between like a Slack and an email, whatever it is. I think we all have multitasking kind of embedded in our days. The problem with multitasking is that what we think is happening is that we're doing two things at once, two or more if you're really ambitious. But what's really happening is we are just rapidly switching between tasks. So it feels like we're doing two things at once, but we're just kind of going back and forth very, very quickly. And that's cognitively taxing. So every time we switch tasks, the brain is like, okay, let me like gear up some more energy because I have to go and do this other thing. And a lot of us do this all the time. And so if you are having trouble focusing or concentrating, that's one area to look at in your life is, well, maybe I need to cut back on the multitasking and really try doing one thing at a time. It's actually more efficient for your brain. Like if the efficiency side of things appeals to you, it's actually more efficient for your brain to just focus on one thing at a time. It's going to help you concentrate better and focus more. It helps with memory as well. So that's one thing to think about. And the other, I would say, is just your use of technology. I think, again, this is something that we all struggle with to some degree. We have these nifty little devices. They come with us wherever we go. They have notifications and they interrupt us and take us out of the moment. And they chop up our day in a way where instead of having this feeling that time is expansive, we have this feeling that it's really all chopped up, right? It's like time confetti. You've got little bits here, little bits there, and it sort of doesn't feel like it's adding up to much. And again, we feel very scattered. We're like, oh, there's a thing here, there's a thing here. Sometimes it's a notification that pulls us out. Sometimes it's our own self-interruption. And I think that is something to really pay attention to. There's obviously tons of things that you can change in your settings in your phone and mute notifications and all of that stuff. But noticing your own impulses around your device usage. So for example, when I started to pay attention to this, I noticed that I had this habit of checking my phone when I was moving from one room to another.
Yeah.
So like, moving from my office to the kitchen, just pick up my phone and take a look for no good reason.
It's
other than
reflexive. You don't even think about it.
Yeah, and you're just moving from one room to the other. So that's a thing that now I've tried to work on and say, okay, either I'm going to leave the phone in the room, or I'm going to notice I have it in my hand and try and wait a few minutes. Usually the recommendation is to wait 15 minutes. Like if you notice that you're kind of doing something reflexively, to wait 15 minutes. And if you still have the urge, then okay, that's fine. Like, check your phone. But usually you wait the 15 minutes and you're like, oh, why do I even have this thing in my hand? So noticing those moments and seeing if you can make small behavior modifications can help. Again, you're giving the brain a break here to just do what it does best, which is focus on one thing at a time and not be interrupted and not experience the day in bits and pieces, which ultimately feels pretty unsatisfying and exhausting, can be quite tiring.
For me, these ideas relate to the productivity software that we think is actually helping us, but is really counterproductive in so many ways. My work experience, how many inboxes do I have? 2 for work, 1 personal, text messages, Slack, Notion, LinkedIn, Figma. I could go on. So I think I just rang off about 10, and I'm getting notifications from all of those all day, every day. One thing that helped me was basically bucketing responses to those into one block, either at the beginning or the end of the day, and trying, and I don't always succeed, not to get distracted by them during the course of the day when I'm trying to focus deeply. It might take a little longer to get back to some people, but if someone really needs you, they're going to find you, I think, right? So if it's that urgent, they're going to get to you. Just one thing that's helped me, but I want to talk about a couple other techniques that you write about in the book. One that stuck out to me is distancing. Can you talk about that, and how does the reason I wanted to focus on it is because I think it was something that's really approachable, something many of us do already in different ways, but maybe don't have a name for it. We don't realize we're doing something that is actually named and recommended. So what is distancing?
So distancing is a term to describe basically gaining perspective, zooming out, and giving ourselves a little bit the benefit of the doubt. So when it's most useful, we all have these moments where we ruminate and we get stuck on something, and maybe we're not super kind to ourselves. And, for example, you think, oh, man, that meeting really didn't go well. I should have done X, Y, Z. I didn't, handle that stakeholder well. Why didn't I prepare better? And we're sort of not super nice to ourselves. And also we're just kind of spinning on the same problem. Sometimes it's something that has happened already, and we're sort of regretfully looking back. Other times we're sort of like pre-worrying about something that's going to happen, and already kind of getting stuck in this negative thought pattern of like, that's not good. This isn't going to go well. The date is going to be terrible because I am this way and they're not going to like that, or whatever the situation may be. And so distancing is a way to zoom out from that like hyper-focused worry and just see the bigger picture. And what it does is it gives us perspective, and we can kind of understand like, okay, maybe my behavior was appropriate, and like there are things I can do differently, but I don't need to beat myself up over it. And what that can sound like is using the second person, so saying you in your head, or using your name instead of using the first person, so I, me, or my. So for example, I can tell myself, Ximena, you did what you could, you prepared the best that you could, and now, and that's okay. Like it wasn't perfect, and that's okay. Instead of saying like, I failed, I didn't work hard enough, right? So just shifting from you to I or using your name as you talk to yourself is one way of distancing, and it really helps to regulate our emotions. Like if you're in a mode of anxiety or fight or flight, if you've got like adrenaline around this issue, it helps bring us back to center. And then the two other ways of distancing are journaling, which can also be really useful for reframing the story. We're giving it a narrative. We're explaining, like we're describing what happened in our own words. That can also create some distance from it. And as well as just expressing self-compassion, and you can kind of sort of trick yourself into doing this if this doesn't come naturally by imagining what would you say to a friend in a similar situation, or what would you say to like yourself at like 10 years old, you know, if they encountered something similar, because we tend to speak much more kindly to others in our lives than we do to ourselves, and we don't always even notice that inner monologue is not super nice. And so by expressing that self-compassion in this way, you know, you can see like, okay, I was doing the best I could, you know, or again, using second person, you did the best you could, given what you knew at the time. And, you know, you'll learn from this moving forward. Like we don't need to kind of like spin on this anymore.
Something someone said to me once that really stuck with me and helped reframe the way I think about these things. You know, you'll give a presentation or have an important conversation, and after the fact, you just keep thinking about it. You're turning it over in your head, like, I should have said that differently, or did that come off wrong, or you know, was that totally correct, or whatever it is. No one cares more than you. So
that's right.
It's like a really simple way of distancing. Everyone else is busy and has their own internal monologues. It's almost always true that no one else is thinking as deeply about those things as you are. So just telling myself that really does help to release the pressure valve and just help me move on. I think we have time for maybe one more technique or recommendation that you would share, something approachable that anyone can incorporate into their life to just on a day-to-day basis cope with these feelings of burnout, stress, lack of focus, anxiety. What would you recommend?
Well, you know, there are so many things that I could recommend, and I'll just show you guys the book right here since I have it. You know, you can do swimming, you can do drawing, you can run, you can walk, you can have a dance party. Like there are so many ways to release stress and get back to a moment of, you know, relaxation and center yourself. But I think that really the big thing is finding something that works for you. So, you know, my husband loves mountain biking. He's like a go exercise, and that helps him relieve stress. I am like, I do not want to be anywhere near a gym. Like I like to get lost in like a good book, like fiction, you know, that's really restful for me. So it's going to be very personal. And I think what can help if you're really not sure where to start is to think about, you know, happy moments as a child or even older, you know, in other times of your life. And what were the activities that brought you joy? What were the things that you were naturally drawn to? And what were the feelings that came along with that? Because maybe you can't do the exact one-to-one activity that you have in mind, but you can think about, oh, like the thing that I liked about, you know, tinkering and claymation with my little brother was, you know, the act of creating something from nothing, or the performance part when we showed our parents. And so, okay, so, you know, maybe you do find a claymation studio or some, you know, you take that up, or maybe you think like, okay, so it's creating is a thing, or performing is a thing. Like, what is a version of that I can do? And it can be very small, you know, it can be, you know, like the tiniest version of the thing. So if you want to start reading more fiction, like great, start with a paragraph every night before you go to bed. Like it doesn't have to be this like I'm going to get all the books in the world, I'm going to read them all now. Just starting small, figuring out what are one or two activities that bring you joy, calm, ease, or that really, you know, can be relaxing. And then finding small versions of that, at least to start, and begin to build a habit around incorporating that in your everyday life.
I recommend anyone watching or listening now or later to check out the book. It's not only so well and thoroughly researched, almost scientific at points. There are so many activities, exercises, really functional recommendations and prescriptions for all types of people who are experiencing these issues with burnout in different types of ways. And I think it does a great job of addressing everybody and involving all different types of people, different professions, family situations, et cetera. Very inclusive, which is something that's important. So pick up the book. There's a link under the video player here for 30% off through Ximena's publisher, Porchlight. We thank them. And thanks, Ximena, for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the conversation.
Bye,
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.